In this video we are going to be going over some of the basic HyperV configurations with PowerShell, of course. And before we begin, I just want to mention that if you want to follow along, you should have a HyperV server with the HyperV role already installed. And since we cannot use nested virtualization with a Windows Server 2012 R2 virtual machine, you can follow along the video that I linked here in this presentation, and I will also have in the description, to see how you can install HyperV on a 2012 R2 VM just to have it installed. We will not be able to run machines on it, but we will be able to create machines, delete machines, edit, and do all sorts of things with PowerShell to test our commands. With this out of the way, let's see what we will do in this video. And as you can see, we will go over some of the basic HyperV host configuration items, then configure virtual switches, then work with virtual machines, create them, edit them, and delete them, and also work with virtual disks, like create a virtual disk, assign it to a machine, and delete a virtual disk. So with this out of the way, let's actually start and work on these topics. I'm on my domain controller from my environment, and I am connected to my HV01 machine using PowerShell remoting, and here is what we will basically do in this video. Now this part, the installation part, will not work in our test environment. I just put it here because in normal circumstances this is how you install HyperV on a machine, but not on a virtual machine with 2012 R2. And I also installed the HyperV tools on my domain controller, so I have a HyperV manager here, and I will connect to my HyperV server, so that when we do certain configurations, I also want to show you here how they look. And when you have the HyperV module installed, either on your HyperV server or like I'm doing here on my domain controller, you can use this command to get a list of all the commandlets that are available for managing HyperV. And there are a few, as you can see. Now let's start. First, let's configure some basic HyperV host settings. And with this first command, we will set the default path for virtual disks, for virtual machines, and enable something called enhanced session mode, which we will talk about in a future video. As soon as I run this, if we go to the HyperV settings, you can see that the default paths have been set correctly, and enhanced session mode is enabled here and also here. You can of course also get information using the get VM host command. This is just a simplified view, and you can also get everything, as you can see here. Now let's also create a virtual switch, and this is actually very simple. If you are not creating a public switch, then you just give the switch name, the switch type. You can also give a description if you want. If you create a public switch, you will also have to specify a network adapter to which it will bind, but it's not the case for us. We will just create a private switch, and in HyperV manager, if we go to virtual switch manager, here is our switch. Simple as that. Now regarding VMs, to create a simple VM that will boot from the CD with 124 megabytes of static RAM named test VM1, you can run such a command. The VM is created. We already see it here. Now, for example, to create another one that is connected to our switch and is generation 2. Also, regarding generation 1 and 2, we will talk about in the next video. We run this command and we have this machine. If we want to go further and create a machine that also has a virtual hard disk already attached to it, we specify the hard disk size and the path to the hard disk. And you see the disk was being created and the machine is done. This is test VM3 and it has the hard disk attached. Now, of course, to remove a VM instead of new VM, we use remove VM, specify the name, also confirm we put it to false, so we are not asked if we are sure, and the machine should be gone, and it is. Now, another scenario for you would be to create a machine that will connect to an existing virtual hard disk. And this is the way you do it. You just give it the VHD path and it will create the machine and assign it that disk. Now this is all for creating machines. Let's also try to modify some machines. For example, for test VM1, let's configure it to have 2 processors, to have dynamic memory with the settings that you see here. We can configure also the automatic start action, stop action, start delay if you want. We can also set a note for the machine. And it's already done. Now you see 2 processors, you see it has dynamic memory, and you see it has a description. And of course the other settings. The next 3 commands will be used to configure the boot order for a virtual machine, but very important, these commands can only be used for virtual machines that are generation 1. So if you create a machine and don't specify the generation or specify that it's generation 1, then it's generation 1. So basically, in our case, test VM1 and test VM3 are generation 1. So with get VM BIOS, we can get a couple of information from the BIOS of the machine, also the startup order. We can create ourselves a new order using an array, like I do here. So instead of CD, I want IDE as the first device. And then I assign that new startup order to my VM BIOS for the machine. And now if we try again, you see that it changed. So this was the case for generation 1. Now in case of generation 2, it's a little more complicated. You see that the command is different. We have get VM firmware. And here it is. The boot order is first drive and then network. And in order to change the boot order, we can't just write text like we do here. We actually have to specify the devices as objects in the order that we want. So if I want to boot first from the network and then from the drive, I first need to get the network adapter of the machine as an object. Then I get the DVD drive of the machine as an object. This is the new order, NIC and DVD. Then I use set VM firmware. And now if I get the VM firmware, it should be changed to NIC first and DVD second. And you see that it changed. So it's not as simple as just writing IDE CD floppy, but it's easier because if you have 10 network adapters, you can just get the one that you want. If you have 10 DVD drives, you can just get the one that you want and place them in these values. or you can specify all your network adapters in a specific order and all your DVD drives in a specific order and then assign them here. Now moving on, in case of generation 2, we can also enable or disable secure boot. It is enabled by default, so let's disable it with this command, and here is how it looks in the settings. Here in firmware you see it's now disabled. If we want to enable it, we just run this other command and it's now enabled. And we can use again the get VM firmware to make sure, and it's on. Besides, for a virtual machine, besides just configuring static or dynamic memory, we can also set the advanced settings like the buffer or the priority, like you see with this command here. And now the buffer is 10 and priority 30 for VM1. And if we take a look here, you see that this is the case. This is 10 and this should be 30, but it's not a number in the graphical tool. Another thing we can do with PowerShell, which might help you if you automate a lot of VM creation in your environment, is that we can disable or enable different integration services. Integration services, if you don't know, are located here, and you can disable or enable any one you want using PowerShell. And here's how we do it. So this is the command to get the status of the integration services for a VM. Here it is. Now to disable, we just use this command. We specify the name of the service and the VM. And to enable, it's exactly the same thing, but with enable instead of disable. Now if we get the integration services for test VM1, you see that we disable also time synchronization. Let's also work with disks. To create a new disk, we use new VHD. We can give it a couple of parameters like logical sector size in bytes. You have to give it a path and the name at the end, the size, and you can specify if you want it to be fixed or dynamic. In other words, if you want it to occupy the space directly at creation time or to grow dynamically. Let's create it as a fixed disk. And it's already done. And now to assign it to a virtual machine, we can use this command. We specify the controller to which the disk should be assigned, the disk itself, the path, and the VM name. And it's assigned. We can also get the info about the disk assigned to this VM. And you see test VM3 has one disk on the IDE controller, one on the SCSI controller. To remove it, just use the remove VM hard disk drive. And now it should not be there anymore. And it's not. So more or less this was all for configuring the basics of a HyperV host, like its settings, virtual machine settings, and so on. Let's also make a small cleanup by removing the 3 VMs and the 2 disks that we created. If you like the video, please leave a like and share it. Also consider subscribing if you're not already subscribed, so you get notified of my new videos. And I'll see you in the next one.